Hello, 7th graders. This is Mr. Shear, and today's topic is the Native American treaties, primarily of 1855. And your assignment today is this Ed puzzle. Now you have a choice. As always, you can watch this Ed puzzle on your own and complete it, or you can attend the Google Meet where we will watch it and discuss it together, and that will fulfill your assignment for today. So if you're planning on coming to the Google Meet and watching the Ed puzzle together, there is no reason to continue on with this video. If you're going to do it on your own, please continue. So we are moving into a new chapter. We're in Chapter 4, Lesson 1, which means that we have completed Chapter 3. There will be a Chapter 3 test assignment on Thursday, this Thursday, 12/10. So it'll be a Chapter 3 assessment. It'll be the same thing as Chapters 1 and 2, where it's a Google form. It's basically just a longer assignment when we have a test in this class, this social distanced way. This is a two-part video. Part 1 is going to be me talking, and it's mostly a background of the Stevens Treaties, the series of treaties that were signed between Washington Territory and the Native American tribes of Washington, establishing the reservations in Washington. That'll be the first part, me talking. Part 2 is Chief Sealth's speech, his reaction to these treaties. It's a pretty amazing speech, and that's the second half of this video today. All right, so just a little background. The first territorial governor of Washington is a man by the name of Isaac Stevens, who I've actually mentioned before. But this is a picture of Isaac Stevens. He is the first governor of Washington back when it was a territory, before it was a state, and he served from 1853 to 1857. Now, the big thing he did during his time as governor is he recognized the need from a United States standpoint to work out and negotiate terms with the Native Americans that were here, that were losing their land to settlers. However, he's a bit militaristic, and he's not necessarily viewed as a bad guy in history. He's viewed as a fairly brave, adventurous person in history, but he did force and travel around the state. He negotiated. In some cases, he came to terms with. In other cases, he pushed Native Americans to sign treaties, giving up big portions of their land and to move onto reservations. This resulted in the 29 recognized tribes in Washington state. And Isaac Stevens is going to show up a little bit more. He later, after he's territorial governor, goes on to work for the railroad companies, and he surveys in the mountain passes in Washington, and he discovers what will later become both Stevens Pass and Snoqualmie Pass. Strangely enough, Stevens Pass is named after a different Stevens, not named after Isaac Stevens, but Lake Stevens, if you've ever been there, is named after Isaac Stevens. And then he dies shortly after discovering both Stevens and Snoqualmie Pass. Isaac Stevens will go on to die bravely in the Civil War. I think I told you this story, but he becomes a general in the Civil War. He's leading a charge of his troops. He's fighting for the North against the South. So he's fighting against slavery. He's leading a battalion of troops. His son is fighting with him. His son is named Hazard Stevens. And his son gets injured, and so does the soldier who's carrying the flag. And the troops are pinned down, and in an act of courage and bravery, Isaac Stevens picks up his battalion's flag, and he leads the charge himself over this hill with his men following, while his wounded son yells, "Dad, Dad, don't leave me." But Isaac Stevens dramatically picks up his battalion's flag, and he re-leads the troops, and he is shot and killed doing so. His son, Hazard, funny fact, goes on to survive his injuries in the Civil War and becomes the first documented person to climb Mount Rainier in 1870. So Isaac Stevens has a big handprint on Washington history, but specifically on the tribal treaties of the 1850s. And the book has this quote, and I liked it. So the concept of white superiority gave settlers the belief that good meant civilized our way. They did not respect the cultures of the native people. The settlers thought that natives should eat, dress, work, and worship like the white people. There is a bit of racism that, well, quite a lot of racism that really is prevalent throughout these treaties and these negotiations. There's a belief by white people that the Native Americans are inferior and therefore need to be moved out of the way. In Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, they need to be moved out of the way in order to create land for white settlers. And that's just what happens. Again, not all the treaties are signed in 1855, but most of them are. But from 1854 to 1856, Isaac Stevens travels around on horseback to each of the different tribes and negotiates terms where they give up huge pieces of their land and agree to live on smaller chunks of their land. This is over about a 14-month period. And the treaties are defined by broken promises. So these treaties are not necessarily a great deal, and in many cases are a horrible deal for the Native Americans, in part because the United States doesn't keep its word. One example that the book gives is the Treaty of Point No Point, which is a great name. But in this treaty, the tribe was supposed to be paid for the land that it gave up. In this case, it was supposed to be $60,000 for the land that the tribe gave up over 20 years. But the treaty stipulated that the United States could change the terms at any time, that the U.S. president could, and U.S. President James Buchanan just decided, yeah, we're not going to pay. So that was it. The tribe was promised $60,000 for the land they gave up, and they were given nothing because the United States just changed the terms. And that's really common for this era of these treaties. Another thing that was, I guess, considered a broken promise or unfair is that many tribes were put together without their customs even being considered. So if you remember the beginning of the year, the Plateau tribes are the tribes that live in eastern Washington, and many of them are migratory. These are the horseback riding tribes that hunt and travel the Great Plains, and they didn't necessarily have a village or longhouses or a space that they could be moved to easily because they traveled over great distances of land in eastern Washington. So these tribes were often lumped together, and oftentimes many of these tribes who were put on reservations, it was multiple tribes put on the same reservation, and in many of those cases, those tribes were even enemies. So the Yakama Nation is an example of this, where it's many tribes squished into one reservation, and several of those tribes were mortal enemies, all placed together and renamed the Yakama Nation. Another issue with the treaties was language. So there is no common one Native American language. It makes it hard for translators who are traveling with Isaac Stevens. So they use the common trading language, Chinook jargon. But the issue with Chinook jargon is it only has about 500 words. And it wasn't enough words in Chinook jargon to really have the complicated treaties that the Native Americans needed in order to ensure that their rights would be kept. So a lot of times the language is loose or not defined well. And as the United States government would decide maybe that it didn't want to honor the treaty, it was pretty easy because to change the terms of the treaties because they were so poorly written. And then in many cases, tribes are made to sign the treaties whether they want to or not. The military was often threatened and in some cases called in order to force tribes to sign treaties that they might not have agreed to. If there are silver linings, positive things for the treaties and for the tribes, there's a couple that the book points out. One is that reservations are technically their own nation within the United States. And what this means is under almost all the treaties, Native Americans are allowed to have their own leadership and their own government. and they are technically, a reservation is viewed as a country within a country. So that's why Native Americans today can have different laws. They can sell fireworks that are considered illegal, or they can have casinos, whereas gambling is illegal in Washington State, but the casinos the Native Americans can have casinos because they can decide that gambling is not illegal on the reservations. So this is a good thing, in a sense. The bad part is that the government, the federal government, the United States government, still maintains that if they want to overturn a Native American law, they can. And then initially, in the 1850s, one good thing about the treaties is the Washington territorial government was good about allowing Native Americans to both fish and hunt off their reservations. And fishing and hunting rights were initially respected. Now this changed over time as more and more settlers came and fishing became more popular and the fish populations declined. Those rights have been slowly taken away from Native Americans, but for the most part, Native Americans do enjoy increased fishing and hunting rights than the white settlers in the area. And especially initially in the 1850s, they did. So this results in 29 tribes in Washington. And Isaac Stevens traveled around and he negotiated with tribes not just in Washington, but in Oregon and Idaho as well, establishing reservations. You can see that the Nez Perce got a sizable reservation, as did the Yakima. But again, that was many tribes pushed into one. Colville as well is the largest reservation in Washington State, but that's many tribes pushed into one. And then the closest tribe to us is the Swinomish. Their treaty was called the Treaty of Point Elliott, and they're just across the water, across the bridge in LaConner. These are the 29 tribes in Washington specifically. Now, I just want to focus on one aspect of the story, and that's the story of Chief Sealth, who was part of the Duwamish. He was a chief of the Duwamish tribe, which got incorporated into the Tulalip tribe. So the Duwamish aren't around anymore as their own specific tribe. They're part of the Tulalip tribe. But Chief Sealth was a chief of the Duwamish who lived in modern-day Seattle, and his name is often pronounced Seattle, and the city of Seattle is named after him. So Chief Sealth was at times called Seattle, depending on the translation, so that's where we get the word Seattle. Now, Chief Sealth, as the story goes, was reluctant to sign the treaties, but at the same time, he knew that it was inevitable and that the Native Americans could not put up a resistance to all the white settlement. He knew their time was limited. And so there's a lot of myth about his speech of 1854 because it wasn't really reported or recorded until 1877 in a newspaper article. But this is how the story goes. And this is why Seattle's named after him, is because he gives this speech. And in some forms, people say it might have been a letter that he wrote to Isaac Stevens. In other versions, he actually stood up and gave a speech. My favorite version is the one that came out in the 1877 newspaper article. And the story goes like this. So Isaac Stevens is traveling the state. He comes to the Duwamish area, which is near Seattle. And Doc Maynard, if you remember him, we talked about him briefly. He had a store in Seattle, one of the early pioneers of Seattle. Doc Maynard introduces Governor Stevens to Chief Sealth. Governor Stevens explains his mission. He wants to set up reservations, and Chief Sealth already knows. All the Native Americans had heard that this was happening. So he listens to Isaac Stevens explain what he's going to do, and then Chief Sealth, or Chief Seattle, rises up to speak. And I love this move. He puts his hand on the head of the much smaller Isaac Stevens. So he puts his hand on the man's head, and he goes on to give a 10-minute speech, proclaiming how he feels about these reservations of the 1850s. So that concludes the first part of our video today. The second part of this video is I'm going to show you a version of Chief Sealth's speech. It's 9 minutes, and this is what Chief Sealth supposedly said with his hand on Isaac Stevens' head while he's explaining how the Native Americans feel about all these treaties and reservations.
Yonder sky that has wept tears of compassion upon my people for centuries untold, and which to us appears changeless and eternal, may change. Today is fair. Tomorrow, it may be overcast with clouds. There was a time when our people covered the land as the waves of a wind-ruffled sea cover its shell-paved floor. But that time long since passed away with the greatness of tribes that are now but a mournful memory. I will not dwell on, nor mourn over our untimely decay, nor reproach my pale-faced brothers with hastening it, as we too may have been somewhat to blame. We are two distinct races with separate origins and separate destinies. There is little in common between us. Your religion was written upon tablets of stone by the iron finger of your God, so that you could not forget. The red man could never comprehend or remember it. Our religion is the traditions of our ancestors. The dreams of our old men, given them in solemn hours of the night by the Great Spirit, and the visions of our sachems, and is written in the hearts of our people. To us, the ashes of our ancestors are sacred, and their resting place is hallowed ground. You wander far from the graves of your ancestors, and seemingly without regret. Your dead cease to love you and the land of their nativity as soon as they pass the portals of the tomb and wander away beyond the stars. They are soon forgotten and never return. Our dead never forget this beautiful world that gave them being. They still love its verdant valleys, its murmuring rivers, its magnificent mountains, sequestered vales, and verdant-lined lakes and bays, and ever yearn in tender, fond affection over the lonely-hearted living, and often return from the happy hunting ground to visit, guide, console, and comfort them. Day and night cannot dwell together. The red man has ever fled the approach of the white man, as the morning mist flees before the morning sun. It matters little where we pass the remnant of our days. They will not be many. The Indian's night promises to be dark. Not a single star of hope hovers above his horizon. Sad-voiced winds moan in the distance. Grim fate seems to be on the red man's trail. And wherever he will hear the approaching footsteps of his fell destroyer and prepare stolidly to meet his doom, as does the wounded doe that hears the approaching footsteps of the hunter. A few more moons, a few more winters, and not one of the descendants of the mighty hosts that once moved over this broad land or lived in happy homes protected by the Great Spirit will remain to mourn over the graves of a people once more powerful and hopeful than yours. But why should I mourn at the untimely fate of my people? Tribe follows tribe, and nation follows nation, like the waves of the sea. It is the order of nature, and regret is useless. Your time of decay may be distant, but it will surely come. For even the white man, whose God walked and talked with him as friend to friend, cannot be exempt from the common destiny. We may be brothers after all. We will see. Every hillside, every valley, every plain and grove has been hallowed by some sad or happy event in days long vanished. Even the rocks, which seem to be dumb and dead as they swelter in the sun along the silent shore, thrill with the memories of stirring events connected with the lives of my people. And the very dust upon which you now stand responds more lovingly to their footsteps than yours, because it is rich with the blood of our ancestors, and our bare feet are conscious of the sympathetic touch. And when the last red man shall have perished, and the memory of my tribe shall have become a myth among the white men, these shores will swarm with the invisible dead of my tribe. And when your children's children think themselves alone in the field, the store, the shop, upon the highway, or in the silence of the pathless woods, they will not be alone. In all the earth, there is no place dedicated to solitude. At night, when the streets of your cities and villages are silent, and you think them deserted, they will throng with the returning hosts that once filled them and still love this beautiful land. The white man will never be alone.